This session's called Example Mapping, a Structured Collaborative Discovery Technique. It's around trying to ensure that we all have the right understanding or shared understanding of requirements before we start doing any work. The approach was created, discovered, pioneered by my colleague Matt Wynne a long time ago. And it was around finding out that teams had started working on stories or pieces of functionality in their code without really knowing what they were supposed to be doing. So there had been a lot of work done by product owners, business analysts, customers to try and specify what it was that they wanted their teams to do, what software they would like to be developed. But when these large requirement documents made their way to the team, a lot of questions cropped up. People started asking about edge cases. They started asking about maybe different contexts in which the specified outcomes or behaviors didn't happen in the way that were described in the specification document. They wanted to know about other behaviors that needed to happen at the same time or that were related or connected. And in general, what the trouble with specifications is that they are often insufficient to give the development teams enough information to actually go and deliver the code, deliver the implementation without coming back to ask for further clarification. And this isn't a new thing. This has been happening from the days of waterfall and before, no doubt. The requirements would come down and they seemed clear to the people who wrote them, but they weren't clear enough to the people who had to implement the solutions. And one of the first ways of interrogating any request that you get given that is not sufficiently precise is to say, give me an example. How's this supposed to work? And example mapping builds on that standard way of humans that interact with each other collaboratively to ensure that they arrive at the same understanding of a single specification. So I'll just go straight in at the deep end. This picture is a representation of the sort of canonical example map that might be created during an example mapping session. At the top, you'll see a yellow card, which has the word story written in it. This represents a user story. So example mapping was developed as part of some training that Matt was doing with a customer who was an agile software shop. So they were working with user stories. And so this yellow card represents a single user story. And the rules underneath are the behaviors that constrain the scope of that story. So any story talks about some benefit that some user is going to get from some functionality being developed. But underneath the story, there's requirements, there are acceptance criteria, there are rules that need to be implemented in the code. So the code that we write essentially is an expression of those rules. Thing is that the story is often very ambiguous and is no substitute for a requirement. And the rule, which is, as we'll see, a replacement for a requirement, is also often potentially ambiguous. And what Matt did was he introduced the idea of concrete examples, which allowed the technical team, specifically the developers and the testers, to test their understanding of these rules by coming up with concrete examples and essentially saying to the product owner or the business analyst, look, for this story, this rule, is this example a correct statement of how you want the system to behave? And if the answer was yes, that's great. That has demonstrated that they had at least understood one part of that rule. And if the answer was no, then you could have a discussion about why was that understanding incorrect and how should it be phrased instead. So there was learning. It was a way of communicating and arriving at shared understanding. Another thing that often happens, certainly in my experience, is that people create concrete examples to question their understanding of a rule, and the product owner or business analyst that is there will go, you know what, that's a great question, and I don't know the answer to that. One of the things that you can do when that happens is you can all have a round robin discussion, and you can talk for minutes, hours, possibly days about what the right answer should be. And in fact, that's often a waste of time. If there's no one in the room that has a definitive answer straight away, rather than discuss what might be the right answer, capture it on a red question card. And at the end of the meeting, somebody takes that question card away, and before the next example mapping session, comes back with an answer. So this is example mapping in a nutshell. In the link box at the bottom right of this slide, you'll see a link through to Matt's original blog post introducing example mapping. And the YouTube video that's linked beneath that is Aslak Hersoy running a 15-minute example on video. So I did mention as we went through that previous slide that the rule card was a replacement for requirements. So first off, let's recap and say that user stories are not agile requirements. User stories as created or conceived in the XP methodology were placeholders for a conversation. They were ideas of things that we might develop, and it was a way of deferring detailed requirements analysis until there was a pretty good chance that that functionality was going to be prioritized and that people were going to be available to implement it. Those user stories, as discussed in many agile methods, are decorated or come complete with acceptance criteria, because the stories themselves are generally too vague, even when broken down into very small pieces of functionality, to really give the precise definition of what the behavior should be. So this idea of rule is a generic placeholder for two terms that are currently used loosely in the software development and the agile methodology world. One is requirement. So I know that there are formal specification methods. I know that requirement itself has got several different formal definitions, but we are using rule here as a replacement for a business requirement, a specific expression of some behavior that should be implemented as part of the story being delivered. And the other synonym is acceptance criterion. So our perspective when we work with example mapping is that the story has to deliver some behavior that is of use to some person, some entity using the system. And the rule is an expression of some of that functionality. So you may think of them as requirements, you may think of them as acceptance criterion. Essentially, the behavior has to be implemented for this story to be considered delivered. So we use the word rule, and it's synonymous with requirement or acceptance criterion. So here's a sample rule. There's no formal mechanism here for writing out rules. There's no shoulds or musts or will haves. It's just a description of a behavior or a way we want the system to behave. So today I'm going to be talking about a library system. Doesn't really matter what system it was. It's just a simple idea. So libraries, in my experience, are public resources. And I'm thinking here about public libraries where typically you can go in and as a member with a membership card for that library, you can borrow a book and potentially take it away, read it, and return it within a time period. And this rule says that only library members are permitted to reserve items. So you have probably experienced going into a library and you're looking for a book, especially in an academic library, you're going in looking for a book only to find out that somebody else has taken it out. So this rule says that library members can reserve items. And it's pretty loose. So what's a library member? How can they reserve items? How many items can they reserve? There's many extra pieces of detail that you as someone who wanted to implement functionality to support this rule would need to have. So I'm going to take a specific example here. This is a more detailed rule. So it's at the library, it's free to take out books that are on the shelves. So, but if you want to reserve them, the library wants to sort of generate some income, and they're going to charge £1 to reserve an item that's currently out on loan. So at the example mapping session that discusses this functionality, the product owner or business analyst, whoever's going to who's going to be shepherding this functionality into the finished system, will come along with the story that is being implemented and a number of rules that define the scope of that story. So there are probably more rules than just this one that is displayed here, but to try and constrain this sample, I'm just going to show a story with a single rule as its payload, if you like. So the rule is that reservation charges should be applied to library members, the story is that, and the rule is that members will pay a reservation charge of £1. And so in this example mapping session, there will be the product owner or BA and at least one representative of the development community and one representative of the test or QA community. And one of them may ask, write out an example card that looks like this. So if Andrew comes and reserves a book, he's charged £1. The product owner will look at that and go, yeah, that's absolutely right. That is a correct example. That's a correct expression of the behavior of the system when this rule has been delivered. Then they write out a second example. So Andrew's going to reserve 2 books. He's charged £1 still. The product owner looks at it and goes, no, that's not what I meant. He should actually be charged £2 because he's reserving 2 books. Say the developer or the tester. So does that mean that the rule needs to be refined? Because it doesn't say that. And the product owner, BA, agrees. It's actually £1 per item. Now, I'm sure you're looking at this and going, this is trivial, but it's designed to be trivial because this is a sample in a 20-minute talk. The truth is that this sort of behavior goes on with every product in every domain that there has ever been and probably will ever be. We need to get to a point where everybody that's involved in the specification, development, and delivery of the product has the same understanding of the requirements. And the formalisms that have been tried in the past frequently do not work. Finally, there was a question that somebody asked in this example mapping session, said, can I reserve 100 books? And the product owner didn't have an answer at the time. And so took away a question card, wrote it down on a question card, which they could happily take away and come back with an answer to the next meeting. So this is a simple, one simple example mapping session played out. Examples themselves are entities that come from our day-to-day life. So there's nothing special about examples, but we should consider what makes an example. How should we frame an example, a good example? Well, all examples exist in a context. So the context that we're talking about here is, well, we're in a library and we're talking about members of the library. Then there is an action that causes the behavior that we're expecting or that we desire. So in a given context, if I or someone takes this action, then something happens. And that something is an outcome. So this is the anatomy of every example that you have ever worked with. So when you're teaching children to stay away from fire or that candles might hurt, you say, given a burning candle, when I put my finger over the flame, then I will get burned. These are, there's nothing special or specific to example mapping about this structure of an example. So let's look at it in the context of Andrew reserves a book and is charged $1. Well, the action is that Andrew reserves 1 book. The outcome that we expect or desire is that Andrew is charged $1. And we go, well, what's the context? Well, the context is not expressed here in this example card. However, it is expressed in the rule that it was illustrating. And it's that Andrew is a library member. So here, this is demonstrating that example cards sometimes omit the context because the context may be explicit, maybe implicit, or at least may be encoded elsewhere in the example map, in this case, in the rule card. There's a number of different ways that you can capture this example. So we've already looked at the prose way of capturing an example because it's a completely non-formal mechanism. You can capture it in any way that makes sense to the assembled people in the room. My preferred way is to take the example card and split it into 3 columns. Leftmost column for the context, middle column for the action, right-hand column for the expected or desired outcome. It works really well with 4x6 index cards, which is what this example mapping mechanism or approach grew out of. Myself and Gaspar Norge have been doing a lot of training and writing around example mapping for a while now, and we've started using symbols to demonstrate, to make clear which part of an example is the context, which part is the action, and which part is the outcome. So we're using a dash for the context, an asterisk for the action, and an arrow for the expected outcome. We don't have to limit it to that, though. Sketches, wireframes, truth tables, pictures, anything that encapsulates a concrete example of how the system should behave is a perfect way of communicating information to your colleagues in a high bandwidth way. And this works really well face-to-face, obviously. Maybe less well if you're on a Zoom call. So we have this idea of of example maps, and the example maps have a story. They have some rules that limit or describe the scope of that story. They have some examples, and they begin to build out. And the really nice thing about example mapping, as well as giving you a structure around which to hang your conversation to ensure that you'll reach a shared understanding, they give you some really quite tangible visual feedback about the state of understanding of a particular story. So if we have, for instance, a lot of rules, a lot of examples, well, we're getting to the point where we're thinking, is this story too big? Is this story well enough understood? Here we have a story that has one question outstanding. If we have many questions outstanding, do you think that the story is ready to begin work on, to begin developing on? And the answer is quite probably no. If a story has huge numbers of rules that it delivers, is it maybe too big? Could we split it? The answer probably is yes. If, however, you have a story that looks, if you have a story that looks a bit like this, maybe you've got the right number of rules. Each rule has got sufficient examples. There's one outstanding question. Maybe it's a vague one that doesn't need answered. Now maybe we're ready to start working on this story. And this visual feedback that you get from the finished or the partially complete story map is extremely valuable. Of course, we've been working remotely now for a year. Maybe some of you have been working remotely for longer. I certainly have. Maybe we'll be working remotely for a while to go. So the idea of having 6x4 index cards and we're all in a room, putting them on a table or sticking them on a board is less likely to happen now. So we have a number of techniques that we've developed over the past couple of years that enable us to run example mapping sessions with remote teams that are spread across geographies, not co-located in any place. So one of them is just to use a shared spreadsheet. So Google Sheet will work, Microsoft Excel on Office 365 works less well, but that is a way of working collaboratively, simultaneously on the same example sheet, and in the background or to the side, you have a call such as a Zoom call. There are tools such as MindMap. So this is a mind mapping tool that is online and collaborative, that is freely available for some use cases and has paid plans for others. It's created by Goiko Ajik, and it's very useful again for creating mind maps and working with people collaboratively to explore requirements for stories. More recently, Miro has come along and has become, certainly in the among many of the people I'm working with, a de facto shared whiteboard. It has a user story map template, which, although it doesn't have the right colors for the cards, you can change the colors, as you can see here, into the yellow, blue and green to conform to the standards. And it's a very useful way for doing online collaboration. And finally, there's a tool that we're working on at SmartBear called Cucumber Studio, which includes a dedicated example mapping piece of functionality that, again, enables, it has a little bit more functionality because it's designed specifically for example mapping, but nonetheless, it does the same job as Miro, MindMap, and Google Sheets. And to sort of wrap up, some sort of takeaways from my experience of using example mapping. Example mapping is a high bandwidth communication approach, for structured discourse to try and reach shared understanding. Long meetings suck. Okay, I guess that's the bottom line. Long meetings suck. Short meetings allow people to focus without getting exhausted. My experience, and also some research that I've seen, shows that after 30 minutes, quite often some attendees' attention will wander. So keep example mapping short, less than 30 minutes. But people say, what about if we have a really large story? There's no way that we can complete the detailed requirements in 30 minutes. So my response to that is twofold. One is that maybe your story is too big, so you should split it up in advance. But if that's not possible because you don't understand enough about it, then take it to the several short example mapping meetings rather than one mega long example mapping meeting. With the teams that I work with, we schedule example mapping on a daily basis. So that's 30 minutes every day. The teams that I work with often follow Scrum or some flavor of Scrum. And so what I normally do is I try and fit the example mapping after the stand-up. So that means that we don't have extra context switches during the day. We just segue from stand-up into example mapping. At the end of an example mapping session, ensure that all unanswered questions have owners. You may think you know who the owner is, but that person may not think that they own that question. There's no point having these questions asked and accepted as being important if we're not ensuring that someone's going to answer them. Give the team some time before the example mapping session to think about what's going to be discussed. So in general, what I look for is my product owners to follow their priority, the priority of the stories in their product backlog, but at least notify the team the day before that at tomorrow's example mapping, we are going to be discussing this story, or we're going to be going back to the example map that we were discussing 2 days ago, but there are now some answers to some outstanding questions. And the benefit there is that means that relevant people can think about think about the story, think about whether they are interested in going to the story or interested or able to add to that discussion. Because if you've got a team of maybe 9 people, example mapping works with 9 people, but it can work just as well with 3 or 4. So there are times when you would want to optimize for efficiency rather than full discussion among the whole team. Which leads me to the next one. Not everyone needs a tent. Much like, I don't know, people might remember the days when we had people around for dinner. If you've got 5 or 6 people around the dinner table, there's quite often one conversation and everyone can participate in it. As soon as you get more than 6 people, you end up with multiple conversations. It's to do with the physics, it's to do with the geography of a table, it's to do with people's attention. And the same is true in an example mapping session. So although at the beginning, when people are learning example mapping on a team for the first time, I suggest that the whole team goes along. The goal is over the weeks and months as your team gets used to example mapping and normalized to it, we have fewer people coming. Those 6 or fewer that come have to represent what's known as the 3 amigos. And that means that there must be at least one representative of the business, typically the business analyst or a product owner. one representative of the development community, and one representative of the test community. Now, in Scrum organizations where you have teams that don't differentiate between developers and testers, and these are few and far between, then you would bring along someone who has specifically deep knowledge about testing and someone who has deep knowledge about development. Because after all, even in Scrum teams, you have T-shaped individuals, and some of them will be more experienced in development and others will be more experienced with test. The product owner and the business analyst, their job is to come along with the story and their candidate rules. So they've thought about this before. This is what some people would call front running the story. They may have thought up examples in their head before they come to the example mapping session. In fact, they should have done, but they should not bring those examples. The purpose of the example mapping session is to ensure that everybody has a shared understanding. Having the product owner or business analyst bring along a complete solution and going, do you understand that? And having everyone in the room nod is not the same as bringing the story and the rules and then having the developers and testers test their own understanding of that story, of those rules, by creating examples. The learning will be less. The achievement of shared understanding will be restricted and limited. So product owners, business analysts, don't bring examples that you created along to the example mapping session. Another pattern that I often see is people go, this is a great idea. They get into an example mapping session and then they start chattering. And 20 minutes later, as the timer's heading towards the end of the meeting, realize they haven't written any example cards. And crucially, that they don't remember what it is that they've discussed. So in general, I ask people to write their examples first and then ask the question, because then at least we have some physical recording of that area of discussion. And when the answer comes, we can collect that answer on the example card. So write the examples first, rather than spend a lot of time talking and then imagine that you will write the example cards later. And finally, this is a short meeting. There's a lot of information to be gathered in detailed requirements gathering. So we need to prioritize high bandwidth communication. Some of you may be familiar with the given, when, then format that has been popularized by tools such as Cucumber, and is quite often the next step after creating these concrete examples is that they will get formulated into a business readable specification using the given, when, then keywords that can be understood by automation tools like Cucumber. However, my recommendation is to absolutely not do that during example mapping. Example mapping should be a place where we, as quickly as possible, extract information from our product owners and business analysts, create examples as quickly as we can that capture the necessary details, but don't worry necessarily about language and structure. Even the prose example that I showed you earlier, that doesn't even differentiate between context, action, and outcome. And if that's the best way that you have, or the easiest way for your teams to gather information and understanding in a fast 30-minute intense meeting, then do that. The given, when, then, the trying to structure it as business readable text, that's a slower process, in the same way as you might write notes for an essay, but actually turning those notes for an essay into an essay is a much more time-consuming business, even if all of the detail you need in the essay is already in the notes. And that was all I wanted to offer. I'm happy to answer questions. If anyone has any, I can hang around on Discord on track A after this, if people have questions they would like to ask there. Otherwise, thank you very much for coming along.